large-scale supply chain. So,
Oh, you're too far away from
from the,
yeah.
right. So, this piece is 60 inches wide by 120 inches long. So it's basically a 1x2 rectangle. My suggestion is that this is a really good size for handing out fabric in emergencies for people turning to both housing and clothing. If you want to do any kind of substantial fiddling around with fabric involving sewing, cutting, putting holes in it, zippers, Velcro, anything like that, you can't just take fabric in a 2-ton roll, drop it in a field, and then have people make clothing out of it. So what you need is a way of turning this into clothing without intermediate steps.
So anybody can do that, right? You know? Knots are pretty easy, but
Knots are pretty easy, but you could use this up time. But not.
pull it up over our heads like this. Move it once, move it twice, pop it over. At that point,
that's clothing, right? So we went from just a rectangle fabric to fairly decent coverage outdoor clothing. We have a little hole where we can get a hand out if we want to move something around. It doesn't need a hand to hold it in place. If I was carrying a backpack, I could wear it under this, or I could carry things underneath it. One size fits basically all. Right? So at that point, that's a functional technology. One knot, one fancy looking fold, functional clothing.
there's more. So now, this guy, do you want to grab the corner, yeah, the center point? A couple of templates and a piece of string, and what we have is a very basic tent. Right, you would pin it out a lot wider than this, it'd be a little larger than that, as that is enough to keep somebody vaguely dry under those conditions.
So the point of this is that you can take materials straight out of the industrial supply chain, right? The huge bulk materials that we produce in 100 million ton quantities, and you can put them directly into an emergency situation without a manufacturing step. So the manufacturing step is where everything bottlenecks. If we could take a chunk of water-resistant fabric and sew it into a tent, you have a factory that does 500 a day. If you take this stuff out right from the end of the industrial supply chain in 2-ton rolls, you could do like 2 million people a week. So getting that interim manufacturing step out, where you turn raw materials into stuff, that's the key. Now, you saw me put this thing off? Now you try.
That's not my brain.
Simple as that. So, anybody who's ever worn a blanket around a campfire, they typically wind up having one hand which does nothing other than hold the blanket in place, or you need a blanket pin, you need some piece of equipment, you can't work wearing a blanket because the damn thing falls off. That little thing, when you twist the piece around and put it over your neck like that, that's enough to turn just a rectangle of fabric into something that works like clothing, rather than having to constantly hold the fabric in place with a hand, which means you could carry work with this because the knot does the work. Simple as that. Thank you. And now, everybody should be able to do this, right?
I don't care. Oh, yeah. I want to. No? No? Oh, who's not eating? Oh, you want to do it again? Yes, of course. Thank you. Yes,
So-
no.
The place where we got started with this kit was GDs and domes, right? So domes are a very old technology. They go back as long as humans have been building, they've been building domes. Domes out of industrial materials are relatively recent. We're talking, what, 1920 something? 24? So a while back,
I was asking.
whether I could design a dome which didn't require any specialized manufacturing. This is like 96, 95. Somebody said, hey, could you figure out how to make a dome out of standard plywood sheet? So what we got was a range of buildings that you can,
Yeah, I know.
super weird. There we go. So what we got was a set of domes that you could manufacture out of standard industrial sheets, which means that you can mass manufacture buildings again with absolutely minimal factory prep. You turn up in the field with a chunk of plywood or a truck, you cut half of it in half, and suddenly you can make a whole range of different buildings. And that is a huge empowering technology. I've been chipping away at that for a while, and Brian is now going to talk about the models and talk about the modernization.
Thank you. So Vinay's initial idea was using the least amount of material to make the biggest possible volume. So his original idea, the Hexayurt, was based on a hexagonal shape, and it used 12 sheets of material. 6 of them you cut diagonally. So you just chop the board in half. And then when you put them alongside together to make a triangle, you get 6 different roof tiles, and then you use 6 of them as wall sheets, and then lift the roof up onto the wall, and you get a Hexayurt. And then using that as a baseline, a bunch of other people, before I got involved in the project, made a bunch of different designs. One of the big ones was called the quad dome, which is using the similar roof structure of the Hexayurt, but then it makes a much larger structure. For context of scale, the action figure is a scale model. So that's how big a person is accordingly to how big these are. When I got involved, I wanted to bring in more unity, I guess, to the designs, because they were a lot made between people around the world. There wasn't much communication between them. And I noticed a lot of similarities between some of the design structures. And then thinking of some of the pieces, not just as a board in a modular shape, but some of the more connected modules as a unit. There was a whole bunch of extra designs that could be built together using a lot of the same design principles. So here's a few of the designs of various sizes that could be built. And there's a website called Apropedia, which is full of appropriate technologies, open source, everyone can work on it. So I've been updating the Hexayurt side of that website, and there's probably 50 or 60 different models now that I've been building up with 3D. They're all 3D designs for now, but I'm working on getting the wooden versions and actual construction areas of them. So the other huge benefit of having structures built in this sense is how they're flat packed. So for example, there's a stacked up little, everything condenses down into very easy shipments, either before or after they're constructed, based on how well you connect all the joints and how they fold together. And then there's some design trade-offs of, even if you could build the entire thing in one connected piece that folds and unfolds, then it makes it big and unwieldy, so you probably want to cut with smaller pieces. And then it's just a trade-off of how many joints do you want to make in the factory and how many joints do you want to make in the field. So I wanted to bring these out, and later today or after, when we're done talking, everyone can come and look at them and see how they move together and all that jazz. So come on by afterwards.
Okay. All right, so I guess we'll get started with the conversation then. So my name is Furbinder Ravindra. I teach philosophy here at Maryland Institute. And I've recently been introduced to Vinay Gupta's work. I think it's quite fascinating. And we have a panel of some of my colleagues here who will take up and discuss these issues. And I believe we are to introduce ourselves now. Yes, Mina? Yes, okay. I'm going to start down there with Carl. Here, I'll pass this down because.
Yeah, for the video. No, it's for the video, yeah.
Carl Williamson, product design.
Agruda Trinkowskaite, Humanistic Studies.
Vinay Gupta, engineer.
I introduced myself.
Bryan Helland.
And Lozado, interdisciplinary sculpture.
There's also been a request, Vinay is asking, can we turn that down? So,
I think it's too loud for the
Yeah.
but I'm sure you guys can hear it back, right?
Can we check now? Carson?
check.
That's all.
No better.
Okay, so, great.
So I'm going to start the ball rolling with a question for Vinay. And if I understand the format correctly, my colleagues also have questions, or they may take up the conversation. Yeah. Okay. So I had a couple questions that I put together, but looking at these plans for the Hexayurt, I'd like to ask Vinay, could you talk about all of the various contexts and scenarios in which you think these are or could be relevant? I think the most obvious one you have discussed in your work more broadly, and even in our conversation today, is this phenomenon of climate refugees, which is a very real problem, of course. But I've noticed that elsewhere in your work, you talked about some kind of, hopefully maybe even a challenge to the housing market. And you're about to go to Washington tomorrow, which is big problems in terms of housing. Many cities in America, and this is a phenomenon in Europe as well, the housing market is getting real. It's getting very, very expensive, and we're starting to see big political ramifications and anger as a result of that. And I'm just curious if you might talk about all the ways in which you think these Hexayurts could be used, where they could show up beyond and in addition to the very real refugee crisis.
Sure. So, such a good question. So let's talk a little bit about end state goals, right? You know, end state goals, what exactly is it that we're doing as a civilization, right? What's our end state goal? So end state goal probably ought to include everybody has a place to live, right? Seems pretty obvious, not controversial, everybody has a place to live. Problem is, $300,000 is kind of a lot of resources to waste doing the job that you can do for 20 grand. Right? The big dome over there, this guy there, like, Ryan, did you put the action figure for scale? So that thing is basically 30 feet across, 28 feet across. So, you know, human for scale, that's a really fairly substantial building. 450 square feet, right? Yes, I see. The action figure is cool, but yeah, so you need these big dudes, right? So 450 square feet is by no means large, but it's certainly enough space for one or two people to share. You know, you're not going to discover you're cramped in that kind of space. You might have an external unit outside for like a bedroom, you know, kids' room, this kind of thing. That big building in the most basic materials possible, which are not fit for long-term use, is $1,000 of materials. You upgrade it to use really hardcore materials that are really fit for purpose for permanent use. You're talking about maybe $5,000 to $10,000. You add your, you know, fridge, stove, maybe some solar panels, bit this, bit that. Maybe it's another $5 grand. $15,000 for permanent housing adequate for one or two people, and maybe another few $1,000s every time you want to add an additional roof for kids or something like that. Or you could pay $350,000 for a concrete box, which was a little bit larger, and which would put you into a, you know, debt relationship basically the rest of your life. So there comes a point where the only reason that we have expensive housing and large-scale homelessness is a political pact that was made between the middle class and the government and the banks sometime around probably post-World War II. There was kind of a deal, everybody is going to get very, very fancy-looking housing, they're also going to get lifelong debt, and we're going to retool the entire system to stop people building more housing. So if you buy a house now, you'll be able to use that as an investment later on. Everything else in the society is becoming less and less investable because manufacturing gets better and better, things get cheaper and cheaper. Old laptops are worth less than new laptops, but we artificially stop technological progress in housing to keep it expensive, to keep it scarce, as a bribe from the government and the banks to the middle class to maintain the existing system. You've got all kinds of people all over America that have made more money in most years from the appreciation of their house than they have from their job. And that's not a state of nature thing, that's an artificial creation of the government as a bribe to the middle class. What should be happening is houses are expensive, lots of people build more housing, house prices become cheap, people still building housing because you can't make any more money building housing. That's what should happen. And we artificially restrict housing supply to keep the middle class middle class. So what could you do? If you were feeling ambitious, you could take some area that has horrible housing problems, illegally occupy a few hundred acres, build housing for tens or hundreds of thousands of people, and then dare the state to push you off that land with guns and bulldozers if they feel like it. I don't think we're quite at the point in American history where that kind of insurrectionary building is going to become a thing, but the notion of kind of, you know, like, what was that thing in Seattle where some folks occupied a park or two? Yeah, if you occupy a park or two and then you build a subdivision on it and then you build a school and then you start sending kids to school, it's a lot harder to roll bulldozers. And so my expectation is that not necessarily this technology, but something like this technology, van life, next generation modular building, something like that, eventually somebody will have a good old-fashioned American insurrection. They'll illegally build a whole bunch of high-quality housing, they'll start treating it like a subdivision, and the state will just be like, okay, fine, they'll write up some paperwork and normalize it into the system, and then at that point we'll see the beginning of a renegotiation in time. I am very specifically avoiding getting involved in those kind of processes myself, because I think it's kind of politically risky, and I have lots of other stuff going on to protect. That's something we will eventually do.
Well, since I'm supposedly running this roundtable, I'm just going to ask another question because I want to. I want our audience to maybe appreciate the urgency of your project and the particulars of it. And before we started here, I was talking with Vinay about where Vinay's going tomorrow. Vinay's going to George Mason University, which is down in Washington. George Mason University down near Washington. And we'll also be presenting on this to the DoD, the Department of Defense. That is interesting. And Vinay knew already, but I was explaining that this is a hotbed of the defense industry here. MICA is all in. No, I'm just kidding. No, but Maryland's economy is dependent on this, right? The entire job, the employment economy of Maryland would be a shambles without defense industry, directly, indirectly. And so I was posing the question to Amitav about why the defense industry would be interested in this. So there is an author I taught in one of my classes, Amitav Ghosh, who is, I think, best known as a fiction writer. I wrote a book a few years ago also about nonfiction about climate politics. And Amitav Ghosh had this chapter about, what's going on in America where we're, and other countries share denialism. He was writing about the various denialisms, the various breeds you find around the world. America is a big denier. However, there are two sectors of this economy, if you will, that are all in and very aware and very serious about the prospect of climate change, and that is the insurance industry, who has no illusion, and the military. And so I thought I would ask Amitav to talk about the urgency of this. Then we talk about the urgency of this project in the context of something that the military now recognizes is an emergency. What do they know? How do they know? Why don't we?
So, believe it or not, I started working with the US military for moral and ethical reasons. Right? Because I tried working with the NGOs, and the NGOs were so terrible morally and ethically that I felt the military were, a shining beacon of honesty, transparency, and truth in comparison, which should tell you everything you need to know about how bad the NGOs are. The NGOs are terrible. They're worse than you can imagine. I'll talk about why in a second. So the bottom line is that the military is in the business of displacing people, right? You go somewhere, you bomb a bunch of stuff, huge numbers of people move around, and those are people that you are theoretically responsible for not killing, and ideally keeping alive. A collaborator of mine once framed this as the US military policy was, well, sometimes you kill people and sometimes there's some left over. So managing large-scale population displacement was a critical missing military capability in Iraq, in Afghanistan, potentially in previous engagements. They've been aware that they need to upgrade their humanitarian technology capability for decades. They've also been aware of climate change as a large future shaping force since the 1980s. So my kind of devil's bargain was, I thought that this project needed a couple $1 million a year of serious research money, and the humanitarian world has no money set aside for research at all, generally speaking. Private enterprise has been very poor at developing shelters because building codes prevent you from doing shelter research and then monetizing it by having people live in it. So that left the military. Hey guys, what do you think? And the US military has a lot of people that went in to fight communism. Now, communism in the days that they were fighting it killed roughly 4 times as many people as fascism. Right? It was the great mass murdering political dogma of its time, and when they went in to fight communism, what they were saying was very much like saying you were fighting fascism today. Anti-communism and anti-fascism were both seen as being very, very similar enterprises. We have largely forgotten how bad communism was, and we've largely remembered how bad fascism was. But when we say, they went into the military to fight communism, this is in the era when the American military thought of themselves as being anti-fa. Fascism broke out, they went over there and killed everybody involved, yay, democracy. Right? And they had a very similar attitude to communism, but communism they decided they were not going to start a hot war with, they were going to wait for it to collapse, which it eventually did. And there's a huge amount of history around the decision not to fight a war with communists and to let communism run its course. The critical document is called the Long Telegram, sometimes known as the X Memo, written by an American diplomat called George Kennan. And if you want to understand what America really is, read the X Memo. It's absolutely fantastic. George Kennan, or Long Telegram, X Memo. It basically explains the decision not to have a nuclear war with the Soviets. So all the folks that went into the military, 50s, 60s, 70s era, to fight the communists, won. Right? Soviet Union collapsed, China decided that it was a manufacturing superpower and was going to embrace market economies. It became capitalist in all but name. And at that point, we got 10 years of world peace in the 1990s, and what those guys were expecting was like hot dogs, hats, and a ticker tape parade. And what they got was 10 years of kind of crappy world peace, and then a massive new global war called the Global War on Terror. And at this point, a lot of these folks became very disappointed. Because as far as they were concerned, the war that they spent their lives winning was won, and now could we please have the peace that was on the other side of the war? And instead we were starting a bunch of wars that were really very poorly thought out. And what this created was a lot of desire to see a better future for the American military than the global war on terror. What's next for the military? And this was a hot topic of debate. Was it environmental damage limitation? Was it humanitarian? What exactly is the military for? Operations, logistics, warfighting. Well, if the warfighting is mostly going to be done by robots, what do we do the operations and the logistics capacity? So there was this possibility of seeing the US military retooling for global humanitarian at an enormous scale, and that turned into a small set of projects that were kind of doing some long-range research in that kind of area, and my stuff got rolled up into one of those projects. That's what Star Tides. It's been running for 17 years. And if you think of this as not the US military as a huge monolithic thing, this is a bunch of folks with a rounding error of budget maintaining a possible future capability. That's kind of where that stuff slots. But to this day, I have never seen worse behavior than the NGOs, and the US military, the bits that I've been dealing with, have always been fair and even-handed, because the branch of the research that does long-term thinking and strategy is basically academics who behave well, unlike the people that are actually pointing guns at people in horrible situations and then doing horrible stuff. So, you hear a lot of thinking about the military as if it was a single integrated unit. At one end it has its universities and its think tanks, and at the other end it has things that looks like unaccountable police forces running around shooting people in the night. It's a mixed bag.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to colleagues now, see if you have some thoughts or comments or questions. I'm looking at Ben or Eluta or Carl. Anybody? Eluta. There you go.
Vinay, so we got to chat before the official event, so I'll revisit some of the topics because I thought you offered a fascinating, very nuanced perspective on what is known to be cultural appropriation, and we as scholars and artists and people who work with culture, we always have to grapple with those issues. So my question to Vinay was whether they encounter any controversy with adopting Mongolian yurt for their kind of new product, right? And I found your answer to be fascinating. I also came across a book by Amanda Lucia. It's titled White Utopias, the Religious Exoticism of Transformational Festivals. So with that, I would like to jump straight into the Burning Man. And I have not been to the Burning Man, but this topic comes up in my religion and American consumerism class when we talk about the appropriation of other people's religious traditions. And I understand that the Burning Man is a kind of the center of that, where anything goes. And this text by Armando Lucia is also a nuanced text, as well as your perspective on that. So I think I'm throwing a bunch of things at you here, and usually what sells in the new age capitalist market is distance, whether geographical distance or historical distance, right? So in this case, that's okay. Good. It's too loud. Yeah.
Can you guys hear it back? Okay, great. Perfect.
Yeah, okay. So in this case, the idea of a yurt is still considered exotic, as well as things happening at the Burning Man. There's lots of exoticism. So I think I'll leave it at that, and that people from other cultures, representatives of other cultures, generously share their culture and bring some answers to modernity's problems or issues, right? And we talk precisely about that. You coming from a mixed culture from India and Scottish background. So,
yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like the Mongolians are a bit of a special case. So, I mean, the Mongolians were probably the most successful militarist operation of their time period. I think they killed something in the region of 10% of the human race in various waves of invasion. And everywhere they went, they built yurts. So it's kind of hard to appropriate something that the invaders bring with them and then leave behind. It's just worth remembering that white folks are not the first people to go on a rampage out here. But to be honest, I don't think it really matters, right? The Mongolians are not a particularly oppressed people at this point, as far as I can tell. They don't seem to be particularly protective of the yurt as an invasion that they created. I think this is just one of those instances like fish and chips and hamburgers, just nobody cares. Right? This is not to say that cultural appropriation isn't a very real phenomena, but in the instances where the culture doesn't seem to care, we should reserve our outrage for the places where people really do care. I don't think the Mongolians are harmed by the world adopting the yurt, but there are other forms of cultural appropriation that are really making a mess. So my kind of feeling is that in all these matters, we should be guided by the folks from the culture being appropriated, and we should kind of follow the lead on this stuff, rather than having a kind of blanket response. It should be very much about figuring out where to target the problems, and where there are no problems, it's just cultural adoption rather than cultural appropriation. Americans were not harmed by global adoption of blue jeans, they weren't harmed by global adoption of sneakers. Scottish people have not been harmed by the global adoption of, let's say, alcoholism. It's just you just have to kind of figure out which parts of your culture are sensitive and which parts of your culture aren't.
about the choice of calling these hexayurts or hexadomes, and yurt also being more of an architectural term of how tension and structures and just it could be used either in a technical sense or a cultural sense. And I'm sure that in the cultural sense, there are plenty of other aspects about it, with the decoration and how you put it together and the symbolism and what they're used. And I'm sure moving in that direction, there's a lot of more potential to step on some cultural toes, but staying in the, you built a really cool thing and let's share it with everyone else from the more technical side, then it's a lot better that it's more spread out to everybody.
And the technical thing is, you know, very clearly, like the one here, that one, this guy here, right? So that guy has a ring at the top which holds the walls up so the walls don't splay open. And exactly the same way that a yurt has a tension ring at the top, that has a tension ring at the top. So structurally, mechanically, it is very much a yurt. The big guy doesn't need that tension ring because of normal structural engineering reasons, so that guy is very much a dome. The yurt like things that go yurts, the dome like things that go domes.
I think I have 2 microphones. Oh, you ready to go?
I have one more question.
Do it.
If you don't mind. Okay. So my second question comes more from my own discipline, which is history of religions. And I'm also fascinated with the kind of whole desert asceticism aesthetic that I see in your work, in the capes and in the simple elegance of the yurt, and how that also, through distance, addresses the pains of capitalist society, and as you illustrated, the housing market, right? So it's interesting that you offer a solution to capitalist problems by saying, be more aesthetic, right? Simplify your life. And here's the product you can do it with, right? And would you like to elaborate on that? Or this is something that fascinated me about your work.
So the construct that we're in right now is, you know, there's no real line between colonialism and capitalism, right? If people producing the goods and the people consuming the goods, and I use that word advisedly, so if the people producing the goods and the people buying and using the goods had the same standard of living, a laptop would cost something like $15,000. Right? The only reason this stuff is cheap is because somebody's being brutally oppressed to make it cheap. And this is the core continuation of capitalism is built directly on top of colonialism. And if you take colonialism out, the capitalism collapses. Now, here, again, we have to be a little delicate about this, right? Because the idea that white people invented oppression as a lifestyle is really ahistoric, right? There were other cultures that were massively good at oppressing people long before white people even heard the word empire, right? China, India, South America, vast, brutal dictatorial regimes of large-scale slavery, while Europeans were still figuring out how to farm goats, right? White people did not invent this stuff, they just happened to be currently the best at it. 500 years ago or 500 years in the future, that would not be true. Right? The dominant empire for most of European history was not the Europeans, it was the Ottomans, the Turks. Right? So, you know, we shouldn't confuse capitalism, colonialism, and race as being linked. Right? Oppressing people so they work for nothing, and then taking the benefit of that labor, concentrating it in the hands of the elite, is a normal human arrangement, and it's what human beings will do unless they're forced not to. People are just like that, and we're constantly fighting against that tendency towards oppression and barbarism and violence. Some cultures are better at fighting that, some cultures are worse, but it is the natural tendency of human beings to do that stuff, and that's why we have to work so hard to stop ourselves doing it. Does that kind of make sense as a starting point? Right? And you know, for my family, half Scottish, half Indian, right? One side of the family were brutally oppressed by colonialism, lost everything they owned, and had centuries, you know, just terrible life as a result. And the Indians, on the other hand, did great under the British Empire. right? The people who got shafted by colonialism in my family were the Scottish side, who were forced off their land at the point of the sword to make way for some rich dude's sheep farm. And the family kind of never recovered. So, it's not that to critique capitalism and to critique colonialism implies getting all tangled up in racial politics, right? And I think it's actually impossible to do a proper critique of capitalism and colonialism and also do carry the racial politics with it. You can't handle what happened in China at the hands of the Japanese if you think the white people are the problem. And that's really important, right? So if we separate out this problem of colonialism and capitalism from the racial politics, it also becomes easier to talk about supply chains, which are split between different kinds of cultures, democratic, white dominated here, notionally communist, authoritarian Chinese, working together in a single oppressive system, right? And that single oppressive system, right here, there's your single oppressive system, designed in Cupertino, manufactured in China. The folks that manufacture these things keep jumping out the windows because the living conditions are so bad and they can't unionize because they're already in a communist country. That's the capitalism and colonialism tied up right here, and it requires the collaboration of oppressive forces, both white and Chinese, to produce this. Right? So it's not simple, right? It's not simple. And then when we talk about the role of asceticism in this, the asceticism is if you pay everybody a fair wage, everything gets staggeringly more expensive, you just can't afford as much stuff. Pretty simple. You've all seen the pictures of Gandhi running around in the black hat. Yeah, so we'll talk about that in a second. But does everybody get a sense of the oppression of people and the depression or the way price of labor using violence? That's just not a recent problem. It predates white civilization by quite a long time. It's really important not to be too tangled up with the current political obsessions of America and assume that that's an accurate read of world history. It's not. It's massively Eurocentric to think that white people invented slavery.
Sure, I'll take us in a different direction. I'm listening to you talk. I came in, I was playing with the models, and I was looking at your work, and we were tying knots. We were talking about how you just get the bolt of cloth, the size, and the amount of processing from the bolt to actually getting a piece of clothing is highly minimal. And so that makes me think, oh, this is something that you're expecting the person at the end to be doing themselves. And now adding this military angle to that, this highly complex group of individuals that have the Army Corps of Engineers that can show up and do kind of more advanced things. And I'm curious, just where are you in this process? How has working with the DoD changed that? If you don't have to assume that, oh, we are going to have very few tools, we have to rely on people's ability to tie knots and pull sheet. How that has impacted the design, and where do you see that going forward?
So the military has never managed to allocate real resources to any of this stuff, right? It kind of runs in a kind of tiny little corridor, in a much larger kind of enterprise. So, the budgets for blowing things up are measured in billions, and the budgets for this kind of research are measured in tens of thousands. Right? This stuff is a rinky-dink little backwater kind of factory in the corner. The crux of this is basically zones. Right? So zone 1, active warfighting, high budget, lots of dead people, serious people. Zone 3, humanitarian state, Red Cross turns up and hands out blankets, 10 to 10 second. Zone 4 is Walmart turns up and starts selling stuff out of trucks, and you're kind of back into global trade. Zone 2 is this gap between military operations and standard humanitarian operations, where there's an enormous gulf. Right? So when the US military screws up, you turn an entire country into Zone 2. Iraq and Afghanistan, they destroy Zone 4, you know logistics, too dangerous for Zone 3, the NGOs shooting them. It becomes Zone 2, it's not after war fighting, it's a peace war for the UN. And when you throw 100 million people into Zone 2 without any kind of support structures, probably about 4 million people died unnecessarily in the process. And that's horrendous, right? You know, I mean, that's just, oh my God, if we had any kind of objective measure of the worth of human life, the fact that millions of people died in Iraq and Afghanistan, totally coincidental to the objectives of the war. The US military had no objective to kill those people, they were just going to kill them in the process. Oh my God, it just doesn't get any worse than this, right? So the notion that you might eventually wind up with serious military investment in handling Zone 2, so you bomb a bunch of stuff, you displace a bunch of civilians, you drop a bunch of sea containers full of this stuff in the civilians, take it out, put it up, live in it, and don't die. From the perspective of the military, all that stuff is like potential future directions for minimizing humanitarian fallout. Right? Now, their reasons for wanting that technology are not particularly great reasons, but as long as the technology gets built, do I necessarily care? Right? And this is the devil's bargain problem of, if you start a charity, you can't build anything outside of the charity industrial complex parameters. If you build a company, you build stuff for people to strap to the roof of their SUV when they go on holiday in Cabo, but it's something like what we do in humanitarian space. Who do you find to fund long-term humanitarian research? The standard UN refugee camp, by the way, is still built using the same tools, technology, and technique as you would have seen in World War II refugee camps in Europe. You haven't innovated in basically 80 years because there's no money to innovate, and if you don't invest in innovation, you don't get innovation. So we're stuck in a position where there is no budget for global humanitarian innovation. There's a little bit of rounding error stuff floating around DoD, but generally speaking, we don't regard the humanitarian crisis as being an innovation problem, and it is an innovation. You know, I put about 100,000 solar lights into refugee camps in Pakistan out of a sanitation budget one year. And that was about the most interesting thing that had been done in critical infrastructure in refugee camps that decade. And it's not that interesting. So, you know, when you have a huge global funding gap, you take whatever money you can find to fill that gap. But it is, you know, it's a devil's bargain. I was not that happy to have to do it. I'd rather the Red Cross had been decent, but the Red Cross were, I mean, the most hostile and predatory response to these technologies I ever saw was UNHCR. UNHCR hates me with a personal passion, right? Because I make cheap, long-lasting buildings, right? The exact phrase was, it's too cheap and it lasts too long. Could you make one that falls apart after 3 months? From UNHCR, right? That's how you wind up working with the military. Why? Because they're evil, right? So has everybody seen those pictures of refugee tents put up in various refugee camps around the world? Do you know that they always have huge branding on the outside telling you what agency put them in the field? Right? The tents are only billboards for fundraising. They incidentally shelter people, but their primary purpose is to be taken pictures of from TV, news crews, to raise money for the organizations. The tents themselves decay in the sun. Has anybody here ever put a tent up in the backyard, and by the end of the summer, the ultraviolet light has rotted it out and the tent just falls to pieces? That's exactly what happens with the majority of the humanitarian tents. They put them up, they take the pictures, they raise the money, they leave, the tents rot in the sun, and those people are left in the mud. Then they raise a bunch more money, and maybe they send out another tent, maybe they don't. There are places like Norwegian Refugee Council, there's refugee camps, where they've been sending out a tent every 2 years for 30 years. Right? The entire humanitarian world runs on a lie, which is that refugee is a temporary condition. So the host governments agree to take the refugees as a temporary measure. The refugees have a citizenship status which doesn't allow them to work, and there's a huge global collusion to pretend that the refugees are temporarily displaced and will go home again. In practice, there are refugee camps in Africa that have been there for 70 years, with millions of people living there. They've got kids that are like 7 generations born in the camps. Right? There is no such thing as a temporary refugee, except for very occasional things like Hurricane Katrina. Right? It's a rarity that once you're a refugee, you go back to where you started. For the most part, what you are is a displaced person who stay displaced. The other thing let me throw out there is you've got refugees and you have IDPs. Refugees are typically crossing the border, IDPs are typically staying where they are. What do you call an American internally displaced person? homeless. So if we take the kind of internationally standard descriptions for IDPs, I think there's a pretty good chance that the majority of American homeless are technically speaking IDPs. And in the same way that you get people that are displaced by the bad political system inside of some far-off country, you get people that are displaced by the bad political system here. Those people are not recognized as IDPs, because if you did recognize them as IDPs, you'd have to give them rights. And so we wind up with this whole schizophrenic language, not schizophrenic exactly, but detached from reality and broken into a lot of competing little pieces, where you've got refugee, IDP, homeless people, the incredibly poor, the landless, nomadic. You kind of have this range of folks that are just kind of sloshing around unconnected to the machine of the world, and they exist in a variety of different legal categories, but actually their survival needs are basically red end. Right? So if you basically focus on the individual human and their needs and largely ignore the argument about their legal status, turns out that these structures work really pretty well for people going camping. They work pretty well for American homeless. I've seen them go up in Africa and India on small test bases. They seem to be fine. And all that stuff is true because the human being in the shelter doesn't care what their legal status is. They just care about whether their shelter works. And so this is the kind of, if you put the human in the center of the story, you do a kind of human-centric design approach, you can really focus on the primary needs of the people that need the shelter rather than worrying so much about the political categorizations. But yeah, I mean, the sheer hostility of the aid industrial complex on this stuff, they're not there to find permanent solutions, they're there to advertise their brands and raise money. And the amount of hostility they show to humanitarian organizations in country, if you have a disaster in, say, some South American or African country, the UN and the large Western charities will do everything possible to starve the local groups of publicity and therefore money to make sure that all of the aid is channeled through Geneva taking a 30% cut off the top rather than going directly in country. This stuff is absolutely filthy. It's mafia level horror.
Well, okay, here.
Yeah, I mean, question for the audience too.
The most brutal thing I ever saw was a woman that grew up in a refugee camp in Africa, went to Canada, became a doctor, turning up at a UN event in Geneva and telling them exactly what she thought of them and their organization, and every time they stood up to defend themselves, she would just take them down with a machete. It was the anger and the knowledge from I was there and this is what happened and now I'm a doctor and let me tell you. The thing that made her most angry was they started not getting their full food deliveries. So they found the phone number of people in Geneva that were responsible for the budget that they were supposed to be getting, and they started phoning and text messaging those people to give reports about the fact that the food aid that had been arriving was now going missing and they were getting like 2/3 of what they were supposed to, and the people in Geneva changed their phone numbers. That's what we're dealing with now.
Okay, I wanted to backtrack a bit. When you were talking about how, like, separating the racial politics from humanitarian crisis, I think it's personally speaking, it's really difficult for me to do that because I feel like America is the case where it came after when colonization was controlled by white people. And so I feel like from my perspective, it's really difficult for me to separate race when it comes to talking about the problems of exploitation. So I guess I'm just wondering how.
I mean, that's a very, if you think about Tibet, right? Tibet is a full-scale colonial invasion, and there are no white people involved in that story, right? It's a very, the white folks will tell you that white culture is the center of global civilization, right? In terms of imperial power, white culture peaked 150 years ago when the British Empire invaded 160 countries. White power at this point is on its last legs, right? It's a teetering enterprise. and the rising, military and dominant colonial powers that are coming up around the world right now are not operated by white folks. The new empires are not going to be white, and we have to deal with them.
So I guess I just wonder how, like, we can, like, I guess, like, educate ourselves to, like, not only center, like, these issues with whiteness.
So I think it's very important here to think of whiteness as being a legal category. And it's just legal, right? So the Americans go through a period where they legally define white and they legally define black. And in American culture, those legal categories are staggeringly evil and destructive. So within the discourse inside of America, whiteness is a legal category. You can point to segregation, you can point to all the rest of that stuff. And in that context, whiteness is an exact and precise discourse and it makes perfect sense. So I'm fully supportive of that analysis where whiteness is tied to a legal category. The hard part is whiteness in Europe. So the Irish have 700 years of full colonial rampage carried out on their soil, murder, persecution, genocide, colonizations, effectively slavery, for 700 years, right? That place is wrecked. I spent a year living in Ireland. Oh my God, the colonial scarring is like, it's literally, you can see bone poking out all over the place. It's horrendous, right? And a lot of that, by the way, was not even done by the English. A lot of that was done by Scottish mercenaries. Right? So in that analysis, from across the room, they're all the same shade, right? A kind of light, translucent blue color. And so coming from that on the doorstep, it's very hard to say that that was whiteness. Right? White people on both sides, Catholics, Protestants, English imperial colonial power, but most of the stuff which was then inflicted on brown people and black people all over the world, it was all started with the Irish, because the Irish were invaded in, 1350 something, and the English didn't start turning up and inflicting their show on brown and black people until substantially later than that. So it's very historic to talk about whiteness in an American context, but it's ahistoric to talk about colonialism and whiteness in a European context, because there's hundreds of years of white on white colonialism before we even get to the brown folks. And it's super messy because the Americans tend to view everything through an American lens, but when you talk about race in Europe, it's so much more complicated, because remember also we had black colonialists running most of Europe at one point. Right? I mean, Africa, the Moors took all of Spain, more or less all of Spain, and quite a bit of the rest of Southern Europe. And that was wave after wave after wave of black, violent colonial expansion coming into European soil. Kind of hard to make that fit into the American story, but it's a very real part of European heritage. So yeah, I think it's worth remembering that the history of race in America is very legalistic, very extreme, and very black and white. You go to Europe, it's a whole different kind of messed up because we had both black and white colonialism. And then you look at Asia, and they had vast, horrendous genocidal massacres on a scale we can't even imagine before they'd even seen white people. It's real messy. But I do think that it's important to attach the white as a legal category into this discourse in America. It's a very different thing everywhere else.
You mentioned that the viable alternative to capitalism was not Marxism, but Gandhianism. And I'm curious what you mean by that.
Right. I need to get something to drink.
Yeah, here, I'll get you some water.
Oh, thank you. All right, so let's talk about Gandhi. Has anybody ever heard political radicals talking about Gandhi? One, okay? Anybody heard political radicals talking about Marx? Yeah, quite a few more. Kropotkin? Yeah, one or two? Right, good. Who are you hanging out with? So, so the thing about Marx is that Marxism largely failed, right? They established a variety of very, very large enterprises like the former Soviet Union and the Chinese regime. They gave it a really good try at a very large kind of continental level, and for the most part they wound up eventually conceding to capitalism, rolling over and doing it more or less the American way, kind of because it just worked better for managing an entire continent. So most of the political activity around Marxism is not perceived as being any kind of real threat to capitalist power, because capitalist power knows that it can beat Marxism. After all, they've already done it a few times. See what I'm saying? So from my perspective, as a very different kind of radical, practically everything that you see on the left, in American society, in European society, is controlled opposition. Right? Colonial capitalist power has no fear of Marxism. Those guys had entire continents and failed to mount any kind of substantial long-term challenge to the normal colonial superstructure. The thing that nobody talks about is Gandhi. So think of the three people that played the Gandhi game for reals: Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, right? And all of those people won without violence, and they won in ways that made permanent structural change in the countries that they were working in. If you want to talk about mounting a serious threat to power using tools that are proven to work, it is not communism that represents the threat to colonialism. Communism, from many people's perspective, is just another form of colonialism as that depends. Right? The real sharp end, if you want to see like serious democratic change without violence, is Gandhi. Right? Now Gandhi is a mixed bag, right? Gandhi, even by Indian standards, was a weirdo, and that's really saying something. But nonetheless, the political ideology works. And it works in a way that was replicated in South Africa and replicated in the US, and it's highly effective. The reason that there is such an enormous void around Gandhi and nobody really follows it up is because it is a genuine threat to power. If you start talking about boycotts, if you start talking about civil disobedience, if you start talking about non-violent non-cooperation, if you talk about ethical supply chains, people with real power start to panic, because that's the stuff they're actually afraid of, which is why nobody has ever really heard about Gandhi as a toolkit that can be applied to overthrow modern political power structures, even though it's been done successfully 3 times in the 20th century. Because it is effective, you have not heard it. Right? And hence, a lot of my work is modernization of Gandhi, an attempt to retool Gandhi for the environment that we're in now. Because all this stuff here, right? Gandhi started with appropriate technology. He designed a loom, a spinning wheel, that people could manufacture in small quantities and use to make their own cloth, as a way of making them independent from the colonial activity of the British Empire. The British Empire basically, had, let's say, coerced labor in places like Egypt growing cotton. They would process that cloth in factories with, again, horrible labor conditions in the UK, and then they would sell it in India. And that mechanism was hugely profitable for the British Empire, and Gandhi said, well, here's the deal. Nobody's forcing us to buy it. If we stop buying it, they're going to stop coming here to sell it. Everybody make your own cloth, or have your neighbors make cloth and buy it from them. If you can't afford to wear much cloth, just wear a couple of blankets. And that approach put so much pain on the British Empire that Gandhi actually visited England to apologize to the factory workers that he was making unemployed for making them unemployed. And they were like, but Mr. Gandhi, you can't understand, you're throwing us into poverty. And Gandhi snapped and was just like, you've never seen poverty. Right? So this is an approach, right? We all know that the electronics manufacturing supply chain is evil. Right? And I mean this capital E evil. Nets outside of the windows on the factories to stop the workers dying when they jump out of the windows. Right? I don't know what the working conditions are like to make those nets necessary, but I think we've all got a general idea. Right? And that is our equivalent of slavery. Very similar moral problems. Not anything like the same level of barbarism that was present in the American slavery, which is, even by the historical standards of slavery, American slavery is an entirely different kind of nasty, right? When they say slavery in Rome, it did not mean the same thing that slavery meant in the South. So always remember, American slavery is a whole different category of slavery. But nonetheless, right, horrendously evil things are being done to maintain our standard of living, which is why you can buy one of these things for $1,000 rather than $8,000. And we are all fully embedded and implicated in this. Does anybody here not own anything that was manufactured in China? Right, so this is our problem. right? Regardless of who we are or where we came from, we are all beneficiaries of a system in which human beings are treated in inhuman ways for our benefit. We are all fully implicated. Now, what would it take for us to redesign our lives so that we were not fully implicated? We'd have to start tracking where the stuff was made, and we'd have to start monitoring the labor conditions of the people that manufactured our stuff. Can you imagine anything more radical than 40 million Americans demanding that Apple sorts out their labor relations or we're all going to switch to Android? How much negotiating power would that give you over Apple? So, non-violent consumer activism to crush the corporations into sorting out their human rights situation is an entirely possible kind of American political activism that would hit corporations right in their wallets in the most severe way, and it doesn't require anybody to go outside and get their skull crushed by a policeman swinging a stick. Given that this is such an obvious way of improving the world and bringing corporate power under control, why have you never heard anybody seriously suggest this? Because it will work. You could have any amount of street protest, the system knows how to handle street protest. The system does not know how to handle mass organized consumer boycotts, and every time that technique has been tried in the past, it's worked. So my suggestion is that most of what you hear about politics is controlled opposition. You are told to invest your time and your energy in a set of organizational principles and techniques which the state and the corporations have absolutely no fear of and do not care about, which is why you could go and buy a book telling you all about that kind of stuff in any bookstore the corporation will sell it to you. Right? If you could go and buy books on, anarchism and communism in bookstores for $9.95, and it'll tell you all about how anarchism and communism are going to, be a threat to capitalism. If it was a threat to capitalism, the capitalists wouldn't sell it to you. It's all controlled opposition. If you actually want to do something which is a threat to power, start cleaning up your own individual moral affairs, figuring out things like the supply chain, figuring out things like food. And when you get people mass organizing to sort out those problems, that is when you see governments scream, right? And I will controversially point out an example. In America, in a lot of places, my understanding is there are laws on the books to prevent people boycotting Israel, right? That would not be illegal if people weren't afraid of it.
Yeah. Ben, would you pass this?
You've already started talking about this, but I would just want to hear more. So you've talked about Gandhiism in the past, and as you're working on it in the present for the future, what do you see as a future in which Gandhiism is I guess, pushed to the furthest it could be pushed? Like, what does the world look like in that circumstance?
Okay, so let's start with the first problem, which is Gandhi's been dead a long time. And nobody has really modernized Gandhi's work in that time period. So if you think about the kind of broad frameworks of electoral democracy, English common law, this kind of stuff, it's gone through 78 years of updates since World War II. Gandhi, you kind of have Gandhi, you have a few of Gandhi's kids, you have one or two people like Schumacher, but for the most part, the Gandhi legacy is legacy. So, at that point, it's not like I'm part of a big living movement and there's a whole bunch of modern work to pull on. Consequently, the quality of the model is relatively low. So, Gandhi's core principle could be thought as being individual socialism. What Gandhi says is, you're responsible for taking care of the people that are immediately around. So Gandhi would say, okay, step one, if you guys are political progressives, sort out all the problems of all the homeless people that are around you, hire them to do jobs, feed them, I don't care, because you are there, you're in contact with them, they're your responsibility. Now that alone is incredibly radical. And Gandhi really meant it, right? He basically said, look, if everybody does their duty to their neighbors, we do not need centralized aid bureaucracies, we don't need a welfare state. So you can have the activity of humans taking care of each other without having a huge bureaucracy to organize it, which was, of course, one of the problems with the Soviet system. When you have a large-scale bureaucracy to redistribute resources, the first thing that bureaucracy does is buy marble palaces. So an individual socialist approach where people take care of the needs of their immediate neighbors, while that's radical, it's also in America potentially kind of dangerous. So you have to think immediately like, really? And then you've got to start thinking about the practicalities. But think of that as being a building block, right? Gandhi also doesn't believe in human rights. You go, what? He doesn't believe in human rights. Gandhi believes in human duties. A human being has a duty not to do violence to people that are weaker than they are. And Gandhi says that's a duty. And Gandhi is a lawyer, so Gandhi says the problem with rights is who's responsible for implementing the right. Oh, another bureaucracy. I know, let's have some rights and then let's have a bureaucracy to enforce the rights, and then let's, we've got some more marble palaces. So what Gandhi says is you have a list of duties. When somebody is in breach of the duty, the society can then say how to deal with that person. Hey, there was a homeless person who was living outside your garage, yes, and you didn't bring them any food, yes. Well, that's a breach of your duty to take care of the people immediately around you, isn't it? Yes. Oh, here's your $200 fine. Just give it to the homeless guy. Now, I'm not saying that that's a practical system, but conceptually, a model based on human rights rather than human duties is a model in which you've got the potential for enforcement. And because it's organized at an individual level rather than a bureaucratic level, you have the potential for making that work without having to create huge bureaucracy around it. The problem is that if you've only got a few people who are doing that, those people then become crushed by demand. So this is where you start kind of getting into complicated stuff. So that is the kind of welfare state side of the Gandhi story. The other side of the Gandhi story is the supply chain side. So what Gandhi says is that rather than having unemployment payments that we make to people, what we should do is we should use simpler manufacturing technology that creates employment. Everybody would much rather have handmade clothes that fit them perfectly and low taxes, right? So if everybody agrees that we're going to continue to create labor by increasing our standards for clothing, for housing, for art, right? No welfare state with nobody unemployed because we'll create labor to soak up all of the additional resources. Rather than having Marble Palace welfare bureaucracy, what you have is everything that counts is handmade for anybody that's middle class and above, and there's no unemployment. Now, all of this stuff is sort of unthinkably utopian, but maybe not. Right? So if you think about this question of the kind of structural violence that led to cheap electronics, can you imagine a future American society in which it was seen as being a toxic and negative behavior to have electronics that didn't have some kind of absolutely clear certification about the labor conditions of people making them? Right, okay, so you're still using a black phone? Yeah, absolutely. Rather than a green phone or a blue phone? Oh yeah, because some kind of copyright or trademark thing, you can only use that color for goods are manufactured in the US. And so you could begin to see a movement where the American elites began to demonstrate moral superiority by literally paying $12,000 for a laptop, and the thing is in a particular color that you can only make if those goods are actually ethical all the way through. And if a company wants to use that color and advertise those goods as meeting that certification, they don't, they have direct financial penalties that are paid directly to the people affected. So those kind of cultural trends, I think you can build many of the most functional parts of the Gandhi ideology directly inside the Western consumer society right now. But I kind of feel like this is like taking something that's 7 years old out of a garage, trying to get it running, and then figuring out which bits of it are still functional and what you've got built from scratch. So what I would love to see is active political research and development to figure out how to modernize and fix Gandhi, and then potentially the launch of Gandhian enterprises inside of consumer society as boutique brands. And if any of that stuff looks like it's going to get legs, you then have, God help us, market mechanisms to finance cultural insurgency. Because if you have a bunch of green brands that are making a ton of money out of advertising themselves as being genuinely fair trade at every level, the prospect and the possibility is that you could push very hard using those brands as the source of political war chest to do the advertising to persuade the next 20 million people that it's time to divest. So I think there is an actionable political agenda there. Unfortunately, it's all sitting in bits on a garage floor. Good luck.
Okay, so speaking back to what this actually looks like and taking the idea of duties instead of rights, a lot of this I think comes down to I hesitate to say it, but personal responsibility, because I know there's a huge debate on, oh, it's corporations with other things who cause problems, so we can't really internalize too much of it. But at the same time, moving forward, if we think of people around the world who have been displaced, like refugees or all the things that we talked about before, they're just people. People have survival requirements. We need food, we need shelter, we need things to live a comfortable life. And since so much of the system that we have in our developed worlds, we've outsourced a lot of the power and requirements to build those things, and a lot of that is, I'd say, artificial complexity. About like a house doesn't need to be a complicated house, it can be a simple house. So the more that you're able to cover your own survival needs without playing the game and being connected to the system, then that gives a whole bunch of freedom to do things in a lot more sustainable way. And I think there's a lot of overlap with other systems, such as like permaculture and I don't want to say preppers, but preppers are into it a lot, of growing their own food and living off-grid and more sustainable living in that sense. So what does this look like in the future? I think more societies in that sense, more permaculture, more building things local, which is moving away from the globalization side of things, which then you lose, of course, economies of scale and things get a little more efficient and everyone has to do more of their own things, but that's what it looks like if you're taking responsibility and building things that you know are in a sustainable way, instead of offloading across the planet and hoping things worked out.
Thank you. Do we have other questions from anybody?
Students? Do you have any questions?
In the back.
In the back.
Yeah,
Oh,
yes,
I'll bring
proceed.
it.
I have a question all the way from the back.
I'll bring
Yeah.
yeah,
I
hang
can also
on.
just project my voice.
Oh, no, we need it for the
No,
video.
you can't do that. No,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
All right. Microphone only. Okay, I just have a question that has to do with palette. This is going to seem maybe like a frivolous style question, but actually as somebody who thinks about experimental fashion and fashion in relation to fiber and textiles, I feel compelled to ask about the palette of these capes. Like where the red and the green are coming from, if that is actually the palette of the way that somebody is identified. This microphone might be dying while I'm talking.
Yeah.
So there's that question, but then there's also a question about style, which I think is like an important thing to address in the situation of a refugee's life of like losing their ground.
Absolutely. Well, so let's talk about the palette.
Yeah.
That's what was available on Amazon to get delivered last minute.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the palette, I have been told that the only color which is not associated with any bad political thing anywhere, pretty much globally, is kind of chestnut brown color. I am personally quite fond of denim. I think simply because it's such an enormous, like it's manufactured in such huge quantities, and generally speaking, it's a pretty decent fabric. But I think this is one of these areas where you use real cultural research and experimentation, or it may just be that we get whatever comes cheapest in huge sea container rolls, and you wind up with like refugee camps entirely covered in like purple checked gingham because that was a back ton. I just didn't know. Yeah, I was not planning on doing this.
Okay.
The other thing I should mention is a project which I love. If anybody's interested in this, I'd love to get involved with. So a lot of the equipment that you want in refugee camps, like backpacks, is typically manufactured by military vendors, right? And it will come in any one of 42 colors of camouflage, and you've got to kind of pick one, right? You can't put like camo backpacks into a refugee camp because then they look like insurgents and some people will nightmare. So the idea is called Peace Pad. You've got like Marpat, CADPAT, and all these different names for military camouflage patterns. So Peace Pad is the idea of having a standard reference camo, which was maybe made of some set of very bright colors that was super visible, that could be given to the military goods manufacturers when they were making backpacks for refugee camps. So they just throw the Peace Pad file in, and the stuff comes in Peace Pad as well as various military patterns. But the Peace Pad would be absolutely useless as camouflage, and it would only really be used for refugee gear. And the notion of making it some kind of like digital camo kind of look, but it's done with like bright neon raver colors or something, I probably should not be allowed to be involved in this.
Well, because camouflage has like a relationship to invisibility.
Mm-hmm.
It's supposed to disappear in front of a landscape
whether that be architecture or land, which is why there's so many different kinds of it to
Absolutely.
blend in. So I guess I just have a question about style under these circumstances, and at what point like affiliation is for the person wearing it, or I mean, it was an interesting point to hear you talk about the Red Cross there, and also the branding, like the billboard that those tents become.
Yes.
But it has me thinking about agency of the person in that situation and like their choice under those circumstances to have style.
Absolutely. So on this, one of the things that I kind of want to set as an objective is figuring out what other kinds of clothing it's possible to make with rectangles cut straight off a roll. So there are some Maasai designs. Have you seen this thing they do where they take a piece of fabric and they tie it at the neck here, and it comes across kind of off one shoulder, and then they take a second piece and they tie it the same way across the other shoulder, so you get kind of like two rectangles will make a shirt or a dress, and then they have some very clever ties for capes. So that stuff to me looks like a fully featured, I'm trying to think of, I don't actually know the word, but like, it's not just a fashion, but it's like a family of fashions. You know, it's a whole, it's like a fully developed cultural aesthetic. You know, it's as fully developed as like the three-piece suit would be for European menswear. It's not just like a bunch of people wear a thing, it's that there are 50 different ways to wear it, and there are all kinds of variations, and they've got their own styles and fashions within that kind of cultural, what's the phrase I should be using for that? I don't even know what you call it. Family of fashions, full range of culture, decisions, I don't know.
I think you're encapsulating it well there, but I think
gosh.
it comes down to like personal agency with style.
Yeah. So the notion that you would basically have rolls of raw material in the refugee camps, and then the refugees themselves could make their own clothing out of them. You know, here's the fabric, everybody gets allocated a bunch. You know, initially you use it as whole wool, and then you can sew it into clothing because you can get scissors and time and thread, customize, manufacture, and so on. My kind of feeling is that you work with the whole cloth as the initial immediate 72-hour thing, and 6 months later they've cut it into three-piece suits. Because if you don't provide the needles and thread, eventually they're going to get them themselves, and one way or another that stuff's going to get turned into real clothing. So I kind of feel like the fabric in the first instance is the emergency phase, and then once they've got better shelter, other clothing supply chain, more cloth available, my expectation is that people would customize inside of that context. And this is the tricky thing, right? So a lot of the traditional garb is very, very highly stylized and engineered. You know, if you think about like any kind of traditional culture where they've still got their own clothing norms, you know, think of like how seriously posh Indian wedding stuff is. You know, inside of a refugee camp context, there's a need for functional clothing, and then there's an aesthetic tradition from which those people come, either more or less close to the functional clothing that goes out. So if you were doing this stuff in England, a lot of English functional clothing is not that far from this. You know, waxed canvas, these kind of fabrics. But if you go to Scandinavia, it doesn't work at all. Right? So the kind of place where I think that there is a very tricky part is what is modern functional gear, which is just like Gore-Tex jackets for everybody, and it's the standard of functional clothing around the world, and what is here are raw materials, make your traditional stuff because that works in the context you're in. I have the feeling this might be very, very, very experimental case by case, because that balance point I think could be radically different in different places. It's one of those things which is like, it might be even more complicated than food and that sort of thing. So I don't know.
Well, yeah, improvisation is really informed by location.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the you know, if you're dumping cheap fabrics into places that may not be suited for that environment, you know, it's like, oh, we've got a ton of nylon and we're going to drop it in Tanzania. Oh boy, wow, bad move, right? Or, you know, we took wool to the jungle and the bugs ate it all. So, you know, it's something where you kind of have to plan for making a lot of mistakes and fixing them, rather than trying to map it all out ahead of time because it's so complicated. But I definitely feel like, you know, typically I figure it takes about 15 years to go from the beginning of an idea to have something deployable. So that's kind of like a year-old, really, we got the breakthrough and we started working on it. Think of this as being like 10 or 15 years of increasingly wide circle research before we would even think about doing a live human test. You know, the Hexayurts, we'd been having rich people build their own Hexayurts and use them for Burning Man for 15 years before we built them for homeless people in America. Because that's about how long it takes for me to be confident that something is not a stupid idea.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Going back to thinking about the supply chain for electronics and things, my brain jumped to, in Europe there's a company called Fairphone that's trying to track those things. I also jumped to a book that I saw your work, and I was reminded of a book by Bruce Sterling called Shaping Things. He introduced this idea of a spine. It's a neoglism that was about tracking the information associated with the object. Now that could be materials as it moves through the thing, or maybe where a thing goes to be dismantled. But it was this possible future world with lots of information. It's just almost so much information that a consumer wouldn't be able to take all of that in. And this book is like 2005. Blockchain things have been floating around. Am I recalling correctly that you have some involvement in an enterprise that uses the blockchain? And if so, I hope you do, because this is where this question's going. How do you see handling information as part of the design problem?
Yeah, okay. Actually, I have an object. I'll have Bryan grab it in a second, which actually shows that system running live. One of the things I would joke about is Bruce Sterling ruined my life. I read a book of his called I can't remember what it was called, Crystal Express. There's a short story in it about a Buddhist technology movement building catamarans using robot factories that were doing like global spread of appropriate technology. I read it when I was like 15 or 16, and there was this immense clicking noise in my head as I read it, like, oh, I could do this. And I then spent basically 30 years chasing Bruce. Could you grab the camera as well, the one that has the RFID tag on the bottom of it? Turns out we're talking about spines. Yeah. So I actually worked with Bruce for a while on a company. So what I actually do for a living is I run a company which does legally enforceable product definitions which are faceted. So if you've got 15 different people who all see different virtues or problems of the product, they can all legally attach a claim about the accurate information on the product. So you say it's fair trade, somebody else says it's non-toxic plastic, somebody else says it's manufactured with expected lifespan of at least 8 years, somebody else comes along and says, yeah, but the problem is, and then tells me the problems in the design rather than telling them why when we last for 6. All of these legal claims and counterclaims are attached to the object on the blockchain. And then the individual assets have a tag on them, so every single individual instance of the asset is tagged. There we go. And here's one I made earlier. So if anybody is interested in this, there's a tag on the bottom of this thing that does a digital signature on the tag. So there's a chip on the tag. When you scan it, it loads up a digital description of the camera in the form of a set of legal warranties that give guarantees. And the idea is that this would be a circular return object. So if you're going to buy this from me, you'd scan the tag, it would tell you what it is, your software would calculate what you're going to offer me for it. If I accepted, you would transfer the asset on the blockchain and pull all the legal guarantees across the and all that stuff works. We don't use it for cameras because it's kind of too much of a pain in the butt to do, kind of expensive, but we do use it for things like real estate and gold. And I've been working on that for seven or 8 years because basically I kind of spent much of my time and energy doing this stuff until I was over 40, and then I realized I was broke, I had no pension, I had nothing was ever career prospects, so I went to go get a real job, and I ended up doing this instead. But I mean, it is something where, the prospect of a mass commercialization, like if you're going to have a large-scale political movement around Gandhian principles of transparency, how do we stop companies lying to us about how their stuff is manufactured? This is what got me into the idea of moving into the domain of enforceability of claim about how physical assets are made. But yeah, if anybody's interested in that stuff, there's a demo. I also have a bunch of business cards. You can come and get look at the website and see what we're actually up to. Did that answer the question? I'm not sure it did.
I think it was just giving you an opportunity to touch on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the long run, you know, the notion of building tiny little clean enterprises inside of capitalism, you know, it's a viable strategy for staying alive while still being vaguely pointed in the right direction. Because I don't know how long it will be until we see real large-scale transformation of society around these kind of ethical lines. But if you make a bet on that, you're 10 years too early, you wind up homeless. Right? If you think about all those 60s radicals that wound up with absolutely crappy lives, you know, fine upstanding anarchist intellectuals that wound up going to McDonald's if they were lucky. You know, you have to think as a radical about how your future will be protected, otherwise you wind up in the pile of broken radicals. And I want my mentor to go on that pile, and I decided that I was going to try and avoid it. So building out functional systems inside of capitalism at a small scale, those become the prototypes of much larger systems. If society moves in that direction, it can then adopt those systems. It's kind of like the fake meat companies. You know, all these people working on fake meat, these are economically marginal enterprises. They can't make the stuff cheap. It's all very shaky. But if you see a huge turning away from animal agriculture at a societal level, they'll take 2 zeros off the price and the stuff will become cheap and ubiquitous. So if you don't do prototyping somewhere in the ecology, whether it's academia, whether it's government, whether it's charities, whether it's in business, if you don't do the prototyping, the option of large-scale cultural transformation goes away completely. So I'm kind of trying to keep the options open where I can. I'd much rather be doing this full time than doing it.
We have time for some more questions from anybody.
I'll do another.
So I want to come back to this idea of romanticizing the pre-modern. And I see so many examples of how throughout the history of consumer culture since its beginning, there was this tension between religious guilt of making money and being successful businessmen and simple life movement. And so, you know, what I'm seeing is this widespread commodification of yurts and teepees and small house movement, or at least this idealization of simple living within the safety of consumer capitalism, right? So it's kind of playing the Burning Man full time, right? And what you're saying is that we have to step into this is going to be the new reality, no longer the exoticism, but that's where the world is moving. Right. Now, do you know any people who live in simpler structures like yours? And what would be the practical advice, let's say, for young people or for all of us if we were to transition to something like that?
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, so my prediction is that the entire existing real estate system is about to crash. So commercial real estate basically got nuked by the pandemic because everybody went to work from home, and commercial real estate prices are down by, I don't know, what, 30%, 50%? Crazy, crazy numbers. So similarly, residential real estate prices have been artificially inflated for generations by people using building codes to prevent housing being built and by various other kinds of financial, and essentially entrapment, right? This whole thing is a racket. Because we got better at doing every other single thing, right? Price performance for every single other area has improved and improved and improved and improved since World War II. Housing has only gotten crappier and more expensive. Right? So why is that? If we've gotten so much better at manufacturing cameras and tripods and loudspeakers and cars and buses and planes, not counting those, if all of those things are improving all the time, why is housing the one area that's moving in the other direction? And the answer is massive attempts to keep housing expensive by entrenched interests. So what I'm expecting eventually is that equilibrium breaks down and you get mass adoption of new housing technologies, not even necessarily first in the US, but as that begins to kind of click into place, what I think you'll get is an enormous cultural tear between the people living in the new technology houses and the people living in the old technology houses. The old technology houses are expensive to maintain, they're expensive to buy, they're not properly insulated, they're made of old materials. New technology houses, lots of glass, lots of aluminium, lots of insulation. You know, that cultural transformation when it goes through will be almost like the analog digital split was in the 1980s and 1990s. Two separate generations of lifestyle, two separate generations of stuff. And in the States, the tiny house movement, like if you let people buy land and put tiny houses on them in California, you'd half or quarter property prices in San Francisco pretty much overnight. It would just slice through. So all the work that's being done to prevent people building these little houses, right? That's literally the oppression in the system, to use the Monty Python term, is the fact that you can't buy a bunch of land, put a little house in it, live in it, and be left alone. This is how people are being crushed under the rich. That simple. There's a guy on Twitter called Shagbark Hick. Right? And Shagbark Hick is a weird dude, right? I'm not making this as an unconditional endorsement, but he's documented very carefully how people are getting out of homelessness in America by buying little patches of land in the middle of nowhere for $5,000 or $8,000, putting up a tiny house hidden in the woods nobody can see, and bicycling to minimum wage jobs until they can afford to get themselves out of homelessness properly. And he says that this is by far the most reliable path for people to get off the streets and get a foot back in civilization. If you think about, you know, in the Great Depression, people building little houses and living in them was what people did as a way of surviving in the Great Depression. If you do that now in America, they bulldoze you. Right? So what we have here is a kind of pervasive structural oppression against not only homeless people, but against people that want to build their own homes. And at some point, eventually, the offer made by the system is so bad that people reject it en masse. You get the tiny house movement, you get the van life people. You know, it starts with drilling little loopholes and mice scurrying in and out of the skirting boards, but eventually it turns into a stampede and all the cattle leave suburbia. And the tower blocks become empty and everybody's living on, you know, land they bought in Tennessee with a Starlink in the backyard, working at their, you know, fashion design development job, whatever it happens to be, over the internet, going to space with their solar panels and their water filters and their electric well pumps and all the rest of that stuff. You know, there is a lifestyle available which is probably 10 times the benefit per dollar spent of housing than what we have now, and the only thing standing between us and it is a bunch of government regulation. Right? I mean, we are being artificially trapped in the mortgage loop by people that want to exploit us. That's where the damage is being done.
I'd like to ask you about that. I don't think it's only zoning, and maybe I was speaking from an American standpoint, but we're in Baltimore, and Baltimore was a center of what's called redlining. I don't know if you're familiar with that, and white people were terrified that the value of their house would go down. But this is a long-standing tradition in America that your home is your most important asset. And while I was listening to you, I was imagining how the conversation might go down in San Francisco, oh so liberal San Francisco, I say with irony. You know, you go over there and you try to say we want to increase, you know, make it easier for some people to live on the street or to live in humane circumstances and lower the price of housing, and they will have your throat. Because they, God forbid, you undermine their housing values. And that's a story in every city, London, Dublin, New York, LA, Vancouver, craziness. I was reading that the right-wing guy in Holland, he largely won because people were incensed over the price of housing. So I'm wondering if that's going to land us in Trump land again over here. But I was wondering what you think about transforming that idea that the home is the most important asset.
So much as I generally dislike Marx is not wrong about a number of important things, right? What you're dealing with is the bourgeoisie, right? The bourgeoisie the property owning classes are causing mass misery among the working classes. They're being forced to pay the working classes something resembling a fair wage because of minimum wage law, and then they're taking all the money back off them again in rent. This is class war between property owners and renters. Right? It's class war between property developers and property owners. This stuff is the structural economy of economic oppression. So if you saw a movement where a whole bunch, we're talking, let's say minimally, tens of millions, young Americans, built their own houses, lived in them, and refused to leave, and forced the government to bulldoze them and arrest them one at a time, that's the kind of thing of which revolutions are made. The real insurrection in America would be people buying land that wasn't zoned for housing, building housing on it, and then forcing the state to push them off it by force. Well, if enough people do that, the state just doesn't have enough bulldozers, right? And you wind up breaking the system and making housing basically a tenth of the cost that it is now, because the people just break the laws that stop them building their own houses. That's what an American insurrection would look like. It's not all this rinky-dink economic stuff. My God, that's amateur league, right? Let's all do exactly what we're doing right now, but with different hats. Yeah, whatever, right? Terrible people, stupid ideas. But if you want to see like real economic activism in America, where are people being most severely oppressed? It's the rent. Remember that guy in New York that ran the rent is too damn high party? Single issue politician, rent is too damn high, we need to do everything possible to bring the rent down. Oh, but can you bring the rents down without harming property prices? No. Okay, so we're gonna crash the price of property. Yep. Oh, is that not also going to destroy the financial system because the banks are all leveraged on mortgages? Yeah. So you mean to prop up the entire edifice of the global financial system and the living standards of all the rich, all of the poor people have to pay almost all of their money in rent, and all that wealth concentrates at the top? Wait a minute, wasn't there totally a thing about that? Yeah, didn't they call it a revolution? Previous revolutions were industrial proletariat who were fighting back against oppression in the job place. Now the oppression in the job place is partially under control, the side of oppression has moved to the house place. Right? And it's the same goddamn racket. In the same way that people organize labor unions to sort out their workplaces, they could organize something equivalent for land rights as a way of sorting out the rent is too damn high. And that stuff is exactly as revolutionary as labor revolt was in the Marxist revolutions. Right? I mean, it's a shame the Marxist agenda kind of turned into bureaucracy and fell apart. The analysis of the problems in Marxism is excellent. It's just the recommended solution turns out to be kind of genocidal in practice. But you have to understand that you are, by and large, a severely oppressed class, which is why Americans get 2 weeks of vacation a year and work like 40 hours a week more than Europeans. That's not happening because things are cool.
Ben, would you give this to the student?
How does all the housing that's currently unoccupied or being rented out as a vacation home and not lived in most of the year, how does that factor into this situation?
So the core problems are technology problems. There's zoning problems. There is, I don't know what, something like 6% or 9% of American housing is empty at any given time. The markets are inefficient. You've got a whole bunch of second home stuff going on. All of those things are contributory problems to housing being scarce, but they're a very small part of the problem compared to not being allowed to buy land and build and live on it. So zoning is what takes all of the land in America and makes it unavailable to use as housing. Building codes are why you can't build small, cheap, affordable shelters yourself. And then in addition, a large part of the restricted supply is then into your sector. So the core problem is the artificial restriction of supply. And it's infuriating, right? I mean, if you think about how fast commercial builders can build housing, how much of the work of building housing is zoning and local ordinances that prevent the building of blah 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 blah, the entire bureaucratic apparatus, right? If you just went the building into straight, right, you could build as much housing as you like, go on with it, guys. Boom, right? Housing would crash in price, it would become massively more available. I'm not saying it would end homelessness overnight, but it would certainly reduce the economic strain of the working class relative to the middle class. and this is why I say it's a class war dynamic, actual hardcore living on the streets homelessness, maybe a fraction of that is caused by just can't afford a place to live. A lot more of it is drugs, alcohol, addiction, and so on. But if you ease up the housing situation for everybody, you also make it a lot easier for people's relatives to find a spare bedroom for their homeless cousin who's got mental health problems. You know, if you ease up housing for everybody, most of the homeless might be absorbed by their friends and their family in a way that they can't be when housing is so restricted. So even if you can't directly just rehouse people that have serious mental health issues, you might be able to absorb the less serious ones back into society just because overcapacity in housing opens up lots of supporting niches. Yeah, and the whole thing about incrementally taxing things like second homes out of markets, those kinds of things are tiny optimizations compared to large optimizations just let people do it.
I think we have time for one more. Anybody else want to ask a question? You have a question? Keegan? Here, come on.
So I've really appreciated hearing about a lot of the ideas, especially like modern Gandhiism, and then just several of the things that you mentioned. And I'm just wondering, and this kind of actually is a decent finishing question, a lot of the things that you're talking about are quite new ideas to me. So I'd really love to hear about what you would suggest if, you know, somebody came up to you and goes, how do I learn about this other from you? What sources, who are good people to get this information from? Because you mentioned earlier, a lot of books about Marxism are printed because they don't actually harm industry. So where do we get that information? How do we get that information aside from you?
Sorry.
Oh, the mic, where's the mic? Sorry, thanks.
All right, so the Gandhi thread, we basically have three shots at the Gandhi thing, right? You've got Gandhi, you've got Mandela, you've got King. So particularly Mandela and King, extensive writing, lots of documentation. Gandhi, it's a little harder to relate to because most of the Gandhi stuff is happening not in English, right? So you've already got a translation layer between the Gandhi material. Yes, Gandhi talks in English a lot, but what Gandhi says in English and what Gandhi says in Hindi may be two quite different things. And the understanding of the political forces in India at that time, I mean, like, India is a far more alien culture than Westeros from Game of Thrones, right? You know, I mean, you guys have all met Indians in America who all seem like totally normal, regular folks and everything makes sense. Wow, that is a 2-molecule thick layer on top of a culture which is as ancient and weird as anything we've seen in modern times. Right. So interpreting what was happening in the Gandhi story is much harder than dealing with, for example, Martin Luther King's, the things that he draws from Gandhi. So those guys for sure. Sarvodaya, which is a kind of Buddhist appropriate technology movement that's very active in places like Sri Lanka. Lots of work. Schumacher, not bad. It's the small, beautiful guy. The entire appropriate technology movement in the 60s and 70s did an enormous amount of great work. Whole Earth Catalog, quite interesting. So there are lots of places where this stuff is kind of, you know, kind of grown in little rivers. But in terms of large-scale, broad brush sweep, Lester Brown has a book called Plan B, which is basically a costed energy and food budget for the entire world. Quite clever. What else do we have? The Fairphone folks. There are lots of little bits of it kind of scattered across the landscape. In terms of single, broad, integrative sweep, directly connected to historic struggles like the Western Union movement, I just don't know. I mean, I've been piecing it together myself out of bits and pieces, thinking there's got to be somebody out there that's done this properly, and I still haven't figured out who. The other big name is Buckminster Fuller. So Fuller is kind of like the, it sounds kind of absurd, but Fuller is kind of like Gandhi for white people. He's techno-optimist Gandhi. You You know, we can abolish scarcity by getting really good at manufacturing things and by making stuff that people need rather than garbage. Oh wow, that's real clever. So, you know, it's there in pieces, but I kind of feel like the modern synthesis of this stuff is kind of this generation's struggle. You know, to be able to say, look, you know, we live in a situation where we've got near slave labor products in the form of iPhones, which are used to do pervasive personal surveillance on behalf of government and corporations for people whose primary source of oppression is on the workplace with their relationship with their landlords. You know, I've never seen anybody just draw a lasso around all of that and pull it together into a single narrative. Also, Bob Black, The Abolition of Work, that's worth a good look. But it's all facets of a thing. And nobody that I've yet come across has basically named that thing and put a thing in the middle of it. Because, you know, when you start mapping, I mean, essentially the structural oppression of the modern proletariat, it's very hard to get anybody to look at that and say, look, it's rent and manufacturing and artificial, you know, it's just a, yeah, I don't know. I just haven't seen the synthesis yet. And of course I am, you know, politically speaking, kind of a hack. You know, I've read a bunch of stuff, I've had some interesting ideas, but I'm not a professional political thinker. I'm not trained as a political scientist. I'm an engineer, and I'm an engineer that butts up against politics in an annoying way rather than a political thinker that also does engineering. So consequently, my politics tend to be a little impressionistic and not very well footnoted. It'd be nice if we had some professional expertise up in here.
I think we're done. Right? Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Vinay, did you say that